Hello and welcome to episode 222 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are breaking down the final week of the CDL Major 2 qualifiers. We now know the two teams that are not going to England to play in the second major of the Call of Duty League season. And we know the 10 that are going and what seeds and what manner they are. It's been a long road to get here, but I think we're finally here. We're going to break down all the matches that happened this past weekend. And then on Wednesday, of course, we'll talk about Major 2 and break all of that down. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. We are live now on a Monday instead of Sunday like we've been doing, but blame March Madness. UConn luckily is winning, but they're getting shafted by getting all these late games for no reason. Even on Friday this upcoming week, the East Coast team is playing at 9:45 for God knows what reason, but I digress. Hope everyone has enjoyed the start of March Madness as well as the final week of online qualifiers for Major 2 because, it's been a long road and I don't know if we necessarily need to talk about it this episode. Maybe we can do it over one of those weeks after the Major, talk about our thoughts on this whole qualifier system and stuff because we've kind of sprinkled it in throughout episodes here and there. But, just as a brief aside, it definitely did take a while to get through all these weeks, but I still think having a system where every team plays every other team is the fairest. And as we'll get into with these matches and stuff, it kind of led to, a lot of teams having very similar records and multiple tiebreakers and stuff like that. So, I think there are pros and cons as there are with any system, but we can get into it at a different time. For now, we got some matches to dive into.
Yeah, we do. Let's start off with Friday. We began the week with one of the best matches on paper. Certainly, if you showed us this, 7-8 weeks ago, we would have said, okay, like these are some of the top seeds at the end of the Major 2 qualifiers. Instead, these were two teams, at least entering the week, that certainly their position in the actual major was not secure by any means. Wins certainly would have helped each of them. They didn't necessarily need them, but they would have most definitely liked them. And in this, we get a Game 5 win for FaZe. Paris wins the opening hardpoint. They win the second hardpoint of the series as well, but they lose both of the S&Ds, and then they lose a pretty high scoring and close overload 6-5. And so it just comes down to S&Ds here for FaZe, which is probably a good sign for Vegas, not a very good sign for Gentlemates, especially as we get into, I'm sure, pretty soon here. Their second loss of this week also played into that as well. So what did you think of this opening match between FaZe Vegas and the Paris Gentlemates?
Yeah, I did. We'll get into the second match for Gentlemates a bit later, but um, at least at this point, obviously a banger first match to start the final week. You could argue. I know we've had this discussion other times about the scheduling and stuff like this, but this is a match you would love to see as like last match on Sunday, let
Mm-hmm.
alone as opposed to first match on Friday. But nonetheless, this was a banger and it lived up to the hype. I do think, despite the end result for Paris's, not counting their last match, but I guess you could throw it into it. But just over these last 2 weeks, especially starting with um, that OpTic match to start last week, it really seemed like um, Gentlemen had kicked it into another gear, and I don't know exactly what could have been the cause of that or what was the biggest difference between all those other matches leading up to the OpTic match and stuff. It felt like to me like they had that passion and they had the fire to go against a team like OpTic and try and beat them, and that's kind of trickled down into all these other matches. These matches have been closer, and there has to be some reason for that. And they've had the whole debacle of getting blacklisted from scrims and everything in between here from all these matches. So it's definitely been a weird set of qualifiers for General Mates, but I'm sure they are glad to put it behind them now, despite the actual results of the series, and they can fully put their attention towards trying to make it into the main bracket for Major 2. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but at least at this point in the week, after this match against FaZe, I did think, it was a decent showing from Gentle Mates in terms of outside of the S&Ds, all the maps were close. We saw, though, like, when Gentle Mates were the major winning team, we saw how important S&D was for them, especially in that grand finals against OpTic, and we talked about that at the time. So it's not like this is a team that should routinely struggle in search when all things are firing on all cylinders for them, but clearly that isn't the case for Gentle Mates right now. They are still trying to find their way back to that Major 1 winning form. And we've talked about FaZe and search for a while, so it's not the most shocking result. I do think, given what we've seen from both teams in this qualifiers, though, like the fact that went down to a game 5 is not surprising to me at all. But FaZe just came out on top, and it's a really important win for FaZe when we get down to the nitty gritty of the bracket at the end.
Yeah, shout out Rickus Mortys real quick in the YouTube chat. He's back talking Boiler Up, which, I mean, Purdue does not really bother me as an Ohio State fan, but just men's basketball bothers me just in general now. That, yeah, we need to fire Jake Diebler. Yeah, I was looking on Breaking Point, and since this losing streak, obviously they're not on the same losing streak, but since that losing streak for Paris started around the end of February, they are 2-10 in S&D since then.
Wow.
So they're 6-8 in hardpoint, and a little less than 500 there, 4-4 in overload, so 500 there. So if you look at the respawns, they're kind of treading water, but S&D is obviously where they're just getting hit from all sides. You look at it, they lost 4 game 5s. Yeah, 4 of these losses were game 5s, 1 to C9, 1 to OpTic, 1 to FaZe, and 1 to LAT. So one of these things is not like the other, but I don't know what to really say. I think we should just loop in, obviously, because we're talking about Gentle Mates, just loop in that second match because it follows kind of the same pattern. Paris doesn't win this opening hardpoint against LAT later in the week. It's actually a stomp for the Thieves, 250 to 107. But then LAT wins that first S&D. Paris ties it up with an overload win and then the second hardpoint win, and then it's a 6-2 S&D win on raid for LAT. So that's an 0-4 S&D week for Paris. That's a 0-2 match week. That's, I think, so they've won one match in their last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So they're 1-7 in their last 8 matches entering Major 2 after being the Major 1 champions. That's really worrying. So you kind of pointed to, like, maybe you were feeling a little more optimistic about Paris going into Major 2 now versus maybe where you were a week or two ago. With all that, though, with the 2-10 S&D record since their losing streak, with 1-7 in their last 8, where do you kind of see Paris? And, we don't want to step on the toes of the major preview, but where do you kind of see them going into this major, considering we thought they were the favorite or one of the favorites going into Major 1?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to talk too much about the major because we got to do that in a couple days. But we and you hyped up this slate of matches for Gentle Mates, especially this week and just over the recent weeks in terms of the strength of schedule and the tough opponents they would be facing. And given the fact that they went 0-2 this week and 0-4 in Search and Destroy and still made it into Major 2, that's a massive win for them because there was a very realistic chance that Gentle Mates might not have been at Major 2, and that just would have been crazy. We've highlighted that multiple times over these past couple weeks, and they actually didn't do anything to actively help their case in terms of, I guess, winning individual maps could have helped in tiebreaker scenarios, but they got a lot of help to get into this position to even have a shot to be at Major 2. So they are definitely very lucky, and I do think Um, it is a worrying sign, especially again. Don't want to get too much into
Mm-hmm.
the bracket and stuff, but with them starting in the play-in, if they fly all the way to the UK, lose one map and or match, and then are done, eliminated from the tournament, I think we are absolutely 100% talking about a roster change for this team. It would just be absolutely mind-boggling to me if they go through these recent struggles and don't make a change. At the same time, I could see those who argue they shouldn't make a change because they did win a major, but I just think the negatives of recency, like, and it could be recency bias, but the low negatives of these past few weeks over the high of winning the major, I just think one outweighs the other, and you would have to consider making a change at the very least. So, um, definitely not the spot you expected Gentlemates to be in, but I do think at least they are in a position to try and make some noise at Major 2. And I think going into these qualifiers, like the way we talked about the play-in bracket and stuff, comparing it to the NBA playoffs and stuff, it's not like, I'm thinking about the East and the NBA right now, how it's always been like
Mm-hmm.
the Hawks, the Bulls, and the Heat. I'm pretty sure have been like the three teams that have always been in the play-in since the play-in was for the NBA. Obviously, the Heat went on a bit of a run that one year, but it's like nobody is actually like fearing those teams if you're the top seed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a team like Gentlemates, regardless of how they perform recently, they are the only tournament winner of this year. You don't want to play them in a winner go home series to even get into the bracket. So heading into the qualifiers, a lot of people wouldn't have even thought that was a possibility, but now that's the position we're in. And it is like, again, they are essentially playing with nothing to lose because everybody is expecting them to struggle just based on recent performances. That maybe that like lifts some weight off their shoulders. I don't know, but definitely talked more about the major than this particular match than I wanted to. But in terms of this Paris versus LAT matchup, definitely was super surprised, especially given the hard points we saw against FaZe, to see LAT just absolutely dominate almost 100-point club Gentlemates in map one. Um, they win the search, like you said, after that. But then the exposure overload, it gets to map three. And I guess this is more LAT focused than Gentlemates in this sense, but it was one of those maps again that I kind of highlighted a couple weeks ago where Neum was the only one going positive and the other three guys on LAT were struggling a little bit. And that got the wheels turning for me. And I was like, oh, are we looking at a reverse sweep here? Like, this is the formula I've said. Like, I don't want to see this from LAT. They are obviously doing well. When Neum played very well in map one, but the winning formula in my eyes at least has been those other three guys on LAT stepping up, doing their thing, and then Neum just being that calm, cool, collected voice in the comms and being consistent and doing what he needs to do. But that happens in the overload. We go to a hard point where Sibs plus 11. Everyone on Gentlemates has at least 32 kills. And on the LAT side, Abizi had 30, I believe, and everyone else was under 30 kills. So I was really thinking, like, okay, reverse sweep time, maybe, but nope. Another S&D loss for LAT. We'll talk more about LAT when we get to their other match, but one thing, I think it was in the post-game interview of their other match, they noted that Neum is using the sniper now, and I think that's kind of opened up some opportunities for LAT in terms of strategy for search, because I think Scrap was obviously pretty good with the sniper, but um, I think Nameless even on the desk was saying, like, it really makes no sense how an LAT team, like, regardless of the team, a team that has a Beezy and Hydra on it should never struggle in search and destroy, because a Beezy's known as that first blood king. Like, you just send him and Hydra together, they should come out 2 for 1 in any situation if they're running together. And then you can come to these strategies where Neum is holding down one lane with the sniper, Scrap is on another side of the map with an AR, and the two SMGs are running down that third route. That's a pretty lethal combination, but then you can switch it up in terms of having the sniper overlook the two SMGs, or you have Scrap overlooking the two SMGs, vice versa. So I do think Neem on the Sniper is an interesting adaptation for LAT, and we'll see how that works for them going forward if they continue to do that. But um, overall, yeah, I mean, big week for LAT. We'll get to their other match later. But for Gentlemates, like I kind of said, I rambled a bit, but they're pretty lucky to actually get into the major, all things considered. It was obviously a tough matchup, two tough matchups this weekend for them versus FaZe and LAT. And they were competitive in the series. It's not like they got 3-0 smoked. Obviously, some maps were less competitive than others, but end of the day, I do think Gentlemates have shown a bit more signs of life in these last 2 weeks than they did previously. And it's just going to be a question of what Gentlemates shows up at Major 2.
Yeah, like you said a little bit earlier, but I put so much focus on these last 2 weeks, but especially that last week for Paris and their schedule, because obviously they're playing two, at least preseason, we thought two of the better teams, two top 5 teams, and it was always going to be a difficult schedule for them. But then they go on this losing streak, and really, like, the only bright spot, the only like relatively easy match for them was against Boston last week. And they win that match. If they don't win that match, they're not making it to Major 2, because then Boston gets their 4th win of the qualifiers. Paris would still be on 3. Obviously, Boston would own the tiebreaker if that was to be a tiebreaker. And if there was a 3-way tiebreaker between Boston, Paris, and Vancouver, which it certainly could have been, had Boston won that match, then Paris both lost to Vancouver and Boston and are out on the tiebreaker. So really, that match was the only thing. You said they didn't do anything for themselves. That was really the only thing. I guess if they had won a different match and they lost that one, it might have still hurt them. So it was actually good that they beat Boston versus beating even OpTic or beating FaZe or something like that, which is kind of crazy to think about. But yeah, it's bad. Like, it's bad for them in terms of standings if they would have beaten those other teams, but it would have been really good for their confidence, I'm sure, because this is a really horrible stretch. I will say, though, there are moral victories in this LAT loss, especially for them to lose those first 2 maps the way that they did and then still win that 3rd map. I think they were down 3-1 going into halftime, and then they scored, like, I think it was 3-1, and they scored 4 goals in the second half to win 5-3, and they just kind of smoked LAT down the stretch of that game, which is impressive. And then they were able to win that second hard point. So then, like, you're thinking maybe it's a reverse sweep, and then they lose the S&D, which it always comes back to search and destroy. If you're not a good S&D team, we have not seen very many cases of those teams winning matches even remotely consistently. And I think that's a problem that Paris is going to run into, especially against top teams. And if you're you're a 9-10 seed, you're just fighting to get into the major, guess what? You're going to play a pretty good team round 1 in the major, and you're going to have to win S&D. You're not going to be able to just cruise through on the respawns, and they haven't been super consistent in the respawns either. So I agree with you that a roster change seems increasingly likely with, they're losing to top teams, they're losing to middle teams, they're losing to bottom teams. Boston was the only team that they were really able to beat in the last month, which is kind of crazy to think about considering how good Paris was before then. They had won, if I'm looking at this correctly, they had won 5 straight matches before they went on a massive losing streak, and now they haven't been able to get out of that. So yeah, it's been really bad for Paris. On the flip side, though, LAT, they played well enough, I guess. There were some worrying things. If you kind of flip the idea where it's a moral victory for Paris to win that overload, it's kind of worrying in the same case for LAT, because the series really could have flipped and kind of spiraled out of control had they not been able to pull it back in S&D, and maybe against a better search and destroy team, they would have actually lost that series, and kind of the reason that we've seen LAT have their ups and downs as well. So I think there's a lot of good and bad for both teams, but that's not exactly what you'd probably expect out of either Paris or LAT going into Major 2.
And I do, obviously you and I don't really like to talk about some of the out of server stuff, but just one thing that we gotta mention because it is kind of funny is clips going around of Ghosty looking absolutely baked out of his mind during the map too. Um, Formal had a reaction to it. The flank posted a funny clip about it with Octane and Zuma going back and forth. Um, that's been kind of a running meme with Ghosty, and I've never really put too much stock into it because generally he's been on pretty solid teams. I mean, you could argue the worst team he was on was that LAT team when he was
Hmm.
the headlining superstar of the squad, and that even that team like eventually got to a point where they were uh, championship Sunday contenders. So. Um, I've never put too much thought into it, but I did think it was pretty funny. He did look absolutely fried, and given the way Genovates have performed in these qualifiers and stuff, I maybe he's trying to take the edge off a little bit. I don't really know, but I did think it was pretty funny some of the reactions and stuff.
Yeah, there were a lot of rumors after the OpTic stint that
Yeah,
was an issue. So hopefully that doesn't remain an issue or is an issue. But yeah, it's not something that people really bring up when you win, but when you lose, people are like, well, that's probably why. But yeah, the Paris goes 0-2. They still make it into Major 2. LAT, they win that match. Let's go back to Friday. C9 versus Carolina. Um, nothing really here except C9 wins another S&D. They haven't
yep.
been able to win respawn, so they're pretty much the exact opposite of Paris right now. Like if Paris could substitute C9 in for S&D, maybe they'd be winning a lot more series. But C9 loses the series to Carolina 3-1. Pretty dominant respawn performance for the Ravens. But otherwise, what did you think of this match?
Yeah, I mean that was really the only thing that we can talk about for Cloud9 at least. I mean we can breeze through their other match too. Cloud9 played FaZe and
Hmm.
FaZe 3-0 stomped them. It was a 31 point victory in the hard point, so that was close. And then it was another 6-5 in the search. I looped that in because whenever I was watching the flank, I don't know if it included the FaZe match or if it was after this Carolina match, but been talking a lot about Cloud9 search and destroy, and at whatever point they were discussing the round count differential for Cloud9 in search and destroy. So regardless of their record, it was a -3 round difference. It was like 58 rounds won of search and 61 rounds lost. So even though they've been looking good, they've had a lot of very close S&Ds. So if you add in, if the -3 was after the phase, it's -3. Um, if it wasn't, it would be -4 round differential still. Which, given the players, I mean that's pretty remarkable. Regardless of like the expectations and everything around that Cloud9 team, like the fact they're even competitive in one mode, let alone search when that's probably the mode they practice the least. That's pretty remarkable on its own, but it's still I did think that was pretty interesting because that just signals that even though they have been pulling out a lot of these search wins, like they're still very close individual maps. Um, but regardless, in terms of Cloud9 versus Carolina, yeah, not too much to talk about on the C9 perspective outside of them getting another search win there. Um, I think it feels like in the respawns, Cloud9, it's really just a case of one guy is able to do decent, and then everyone else on Cloud9 is negative, and then it feels like Encourage has been a little more consistent than the others in terms of respawn KD. But I mean, there's even times where it's just like it feels like it's just random. Like one guy will do well, and the rest struggle. So, not much to write home there about from Cloud9. Will be interesting to see. Obviously, they're not going to Major 2, so I am interested to see if they will um, make any roster changes or anything ahead of Major 3. So I'm not expecting them to, just given the whole financial situation and everything like that. But it's a possibility. Um, in terms of Carolina, though, kind of like you said, pretty strong performance in the respawns. And Lurch just continues to be that standout guy for me. I mean, even in the search, he went 10-7. He's been playing lights out recently over these weeks, and it really, I can't pinpoint the exact moment it started to turn around. Obviously, last week he had that insane 1v4, but even before that, I was starting to be like, okay, he's picking up a little bit and playing pretty well. Obviously, rookie coming into the year, and for some guys, it takes a little time to acclimate to the pace of play in the CDL and all that. And given the um, situation with Carolina early this year with Slasher, and then Exceed coming in, and then they get off to a 5-0 start with Exceed, and then they fall flat at the major. Like, been a bit of a roller coaster ride for everyone involved with Carolina, let alone the rookies. But definitely been super impressed with Lurks as of late, and I'm interested to see if he's able to carry over these recent statistical performances in the qualifiers to land.
Just to kind of finish up on C9, because I'm sure we won't talk about them on the next episode because they're not going. But yeah, I would not be surprised if there's a roster change. I really don't know what they would change, honestly, because if you're just looking at it, like, Ocus is by far the weakest respawn player for them, but he's one of the best S&D players for them. He's also their sniper, so you'd obviously have to move some things around, I'm sure. Like you said, Encourage is probably their best respawn slayer, but he underperforms in S&D, which is something that they're good at. So maybe you could say, like, we can keep Encourage, but we can get rid of Ocus. Like, I don't really know, but I was looking at their breaking point page and just absolutely stunning numbers from them. So they played 11 matches, of course, all online, and they went 7-6 in S&D as a team. So they finished with a winning record in S&D.
7-6 is 13.
Yeah, because they went to 2 game 5s, or yeah, they have 18 hard. Yeah,
sorry.
No, you're fine. But they went 7-6 in S&D. They went 3-8 in Overload. Could you guess how many hard point wins they finished with in the Major 2 qualifiers?
I'm gonna go with 2.
It's 1. They finished 1-17 in hard point. So they were 4-25 in respawns. They were 7-6 in S&D. Yeah, like, I mean, if you're going to make roster changes, you have to make them in that regard. You have to make it to actually improve meaningfully in respawns, because it's great that they're winning these S&Ds. I guess we should maybe tweak the S&D wins championships. You cannot only win S&D and win championships. You do have to win a few respawns here and there. 4 out of your 29 respawn maps, just not going to do it. You got to win a little more consistently than that. So yeah, they have to improve in that regard. Maybe that's something that will come with time. We typically think of it the reverse, like you said, that S&D was the last thing, like the last piece of the puzzle. They've seemed to solve that, relatively speaking, at least, compared to what they are in the respawns, and they haven't been able to put the respawn together. So that's very kind of confounding. I don't know how you go about fixing that, but I would not be surprised if C9 makes a roster change between the Major 2 qualifiers and the beginning of Major 3. We will have to see. Carolina, on the other hand, like you said, Lurks had a great series. He's continued. I would say he's had he's coming on for the Rookie of the Year contender. We kind of said that Trakes is having a kind of a moment as well, which I think that's, like you said, it takes some of these rookies time to get into the swing of things, get used to their teammates, get used to the role that they're expected to play in, especially with Carolina. Things changed with Slasher's retirement and Exceed coming into the roster. They had that incredible end to the Major 1 qualifiers. So things have not been, smooth sailing for either Miami or Carolina. But we got to see Carolina win this match, and then fittingly, we got to see Carolina versus Miami on Saturday to start off the day. And we just talked about 2 of the Rookie of the Year candidates. They get to play each other, and this was a really entertaining series, one of the better series of the entire weekend. Miami had been on this win streak. We talked about it last week, how they were, basically aside from OpTic, the hottest team in the CDL. And then Carolina is able to actually win this match, something that we haven't really seen the Ravens do very consistently, and that's beat a relatively good team. They've been farming a lot of the bottom tier teams, or maybe some of the teams that are in that middle of the pack range, but they're able to win this series basically because of S&D. They win both of the searches in the series, as well as the opening hard point. Miami, we talked about it. They were really good in S&D. They were kind of surging in that department, and then they lose both of the searches in this series. What did this series kind of tell you about each of these teams? Obviously, Carolina goes 2-0 to finish the qualifiers, so they continue a tradition that they finish the qualifiers very well. And then Miami, they lose S&D when we certainly were not expecting that.
Yeah, I mean, especially given the fact that Cloud9 was able to beat Carolina in search, it was especially surprising that Carolina took both searches from Miami. It was 6-4, 6-4, so it wasn't like the landslide in victories for the searches, but nonetheless a huge win for Carolina. Really, I don't think either of us saw this one coming and anticipated it. But I can't remember did Miami have another?
Yeah, they played
against
Boston.
So I might have been I might be mixing up the analysis from the desk there. I think they were obviously I think it was the desk segment before the Miami Boston match. They were talking about like experimenting with map pool stuff and whatnot. So they might not have been doing it as much here. I would have to look, and I didn't, so I'm not gonna fake it. But overall, it's just pretty surprising that Carolina got this win. But I did put down in the notes a little bit of the power duo. Trakes and Super have been a bit of a power duo for Miami during their recent success, and they both struggled a bit to start the map one. Super and Rancor played pretty well, and that was obviously the duo once Super was added to the lineup. So last year, Super and Rancor turned it up a bit in the Overload, which was pretty one-sided. But outside of that, yeah, that was the one thing that kind of stood out for me for Miami, was that, like, obviously a lot of the success, I feel like it's been Super and Trakes leading the way for them. I did note down during the Miami Boston match that I guess we're just looping that in now. Didn't even really mean it, but came to mind because Metals struggled in the game 5, went 2-10 for Miami, but then we look at the matchup against Boston, and obviously it's against Boston, a team that's not going to be at the major, but Metals was leading the way in the map 1 victory for Miami there against Boston. And I think he could really be the X factor for this team. I think a lot of eyes have obviously been on Trakes as that rookie, as that unknown commodity coming into the season, but I do think he's steadily improved a bit throughout these qualifiers in particular, and really like shown himself as one of the top rookies, regardless of whether you have him at 1-2, wherever. But Metals, Metals is that veteran on that team, and if he is the one leading the way for this team, that could really be a scary proposition for the other teams, because that Super and Rancor should be pretty consistent for the most part, and then it's just Trakes. Like, if Trakes plays the way he's been playing, you get consistent slaying out of Rancor and Super. Metals showing up and leading the charge statistically could really just be like, that next evolution of Miami. And I again don't want to put too much stock into it because it was against Boston. And it's different to compare S&D stats to hardpoint stats, but I mean, those were literally the last map against Carolina into the first map of Boston. Just pretty stark difference in performance out of Metals, and obviously one led to a loss and the other led to a win. So that definitely did stick out to me. I don't think anything too crazy really happened, I guess, in terms of that S&D for Miami against Boston. That was more of what I was talking about with the Super and Trakes duo, because Super goes 12-6, Trakes goes 10-6. I feel like that's been just based on my memory of writing down the stats in our notes and everything like that, I feel like when Miami's going right, it's been a lot of super and trakes leading the way. And that obviously wasn't the case in the Carolina match, and that could have played a factor in uh, what I would consider an upset. So, um, good on Carolina, though, for being able to close out the qualifiers with some much needed wins for them.
Yeah, Carolina, they started the qualifiers winning one of their first four. They went on a 3-match losing streak against LAT, Paris, and Falcons. Certainly teams that you probably would expect them to lose to. And then they finished it with 5 wins in their last 7 matches. Only losses against OpTic. Again, somebody you would expect in FaZe, even though FaZe has not been super solid in these qualifiers. That's also a team that you might expect them to lose too. But they beat Miami, they beat C9, they beat G2, they beat Vancouver, and they beat Boston. The teams that you would probably expect them to either win or be competitive with in general. But that's a great way to finish. I am very interested to see if they're able to actually keep this momentum going into Major 2. We saw that it fell apart very quickly, very spectacularly at Major 1. This seems a lot more like realistic. Like they were,
Eh,
I mean, they were depending on who they play, of course, and like,
well,
yeah, it's not gonna
they're
be,
in the play-in.
yeah, it's not gonna be easy. But I would just say that at least with Major 1, that was like, okay, they are the best team in the league. This seems a lot more realistic for Carolina to continue, where they could beat 6 of the teams in the CDL, maybe 7 of the teams in the CDL, but they're still hitting up against that ceiling of the top teams. And that's all I'll say. I don't want to say they're like world title contenders or anything.
Well, no, I don't want to say that, but I mean, we'll get to it eventually. They're in the play-in match and they're playing gentlemates. If
Yeah.
they lose to gentlemates, they're just done, and they get another last place finish at both majors, despite their performances in the qualifiers.
Yep. I mean, that's what happens when you lose matches like as consistently as they did to start off these qualifiers. They could have had a great seed. I mean, so many of these teams just lost a bunch of matches. And if Carolina had been a little more consistent, if they had, for example, just beaten Falcons in the early going or beat LAT when they were still getting used to Neum, they would be in a completely different position. But that's not how things work out. So they're going to have an uphill battle for sure. They did finish on a high note. Miami, they finish on a high note with obviously beating Boston. Yeah, I mean that match just in general, like I think the Breach had already been eliminated. Like even if they
Yeah.
won that match, like there was no chance. And I think that's a pretty depressing kind of position to be put in not to be put into put yourself in for the Breach, because there's no hope. Like it doesn't matter what happens in that match. You could 3-0 them and it could be done in 15 minutes. It doesn't actually change anything about what happened in the first 10 matches of the qualifiers. But it's a great way for Miami to finish. It's they played really, really well down the stretch of these qualifiers, and they deserve as high of a seed as they got. Anything else before we
Just
move
on
on?
just on the Boston front, because this is
Yeah.
their only match, and probably don't need to talk about that more. Already talked about the first 2 maps, but really for me, map 3, I literally didn't even like pay much attention to the stats or put them down in the notes. The one thing that really stood out to me in this overload was the Boston listen in, and it was honestly just like really depressing. And there was one instance where Nasty like tried to make a play call. It was I think they had either 1 or 2 kills, and he was kind of like, "Can we take the ball and go here?" And he obviously said a call out. I don't remember exactly what the call out was, and it was like nobody they were like, "No, we can't." It was like very hesitant, and it was just like, and regardless of whatever he called, they all died like right after that, or 3 of them died right after that. It was just like it was a pretty unfortunate timing in terms of when it happened and the result of it, because even if Nasty made like the greatest play call of all time and they were all on the same page and they did it and then they just die, it didn't matter even if they like followed through with it. um but that was just a signal to me of kind of like something's got to change here with this Boston team, especially now they aren't at Major 2. um I said it at a time when we were talking about Toronto with Insight and Kleenex when they were struggling at the start of the qualifiers, and now it just turns out to be true for Nasty. Like Nasty not having the opportunity to play in a UK tournament when it's the first tournament back in the UK in however many years. That's got to really sting for him, and I feel for him because I do think, especially over this last year and plus and change, he has shown he can be a valuable piece to a team that is competitive and can, as we saw last year, can get to grand finals. But I think Boston has to do something, and I don't think they are going to because they've already they brought in Spart. I think the only thing we mentioned it before, if some team after this major tries to acquire Nasty, that could open the door because they seemingly, Boston's probably not going to get rid of Spart at this point. They have not wanted to get rid of Snoopy regardless.
I think it's Purge.
And that's what I'm saying. So it's either Purge is dropped or Nasty gets traded / bought out by another team. And I just don't know how willing Boston will be to do either of those. But I mean, multiple times now, I talked about it from a listening from Purge's perspective, whatever match that was in, and now there's another listening here where it's just like some unfortunate stuff going on for this Boston team. I think they need a vibe change, and they got to get something to try and turn things around because at this point, missing a major is huge, and it's if you're okay with not being at champs and whatever the case may be, like then you can stand pat. But I don't know. A lot of questions around what Boston does before Major 3.
They won 3 matches in the Major 1 qualifiers. They won 3 matches in the Major 2 qualifiers. They did not win a match at Major 1. They are not going to Major 2. So they're in 11th place, I believe, in the CDL. This is a team that, really, I wouldn't say squeaked in necessarily last year, but like they weren't in a good position or like a very solid position to make champs, but they did, and then they make a run, and that's great for them. At the same point, and I've obviously sung their praises about being like consistent. They had their roster for a really long time, especially compared to a lot of other teams in the CDL, and I love that they kind of relied on that consistency last year to win some of those matches and to make some runs, especially late in the season. At the same point, though, like Spart has looked pretty good since he's come back into the CDL. Nasty has looked very good this entire season. Snoopy has his moments. I don't think he's the weak point of this team. I think it's Purge, and I think that the only way that Boston is gonna really even be remotely competitive to even make champs this year is by making a change and bringing in some challengers player for him. I don't know who the player is because he plays a role that is not extremely glamorous by any means. This is also not a team that is going to set the world on fire no matter what. And like you said, and really with a lot of these teams, who knows what the financial situation is and how willing they are to spend any money, and is it worth it to be in the CDL on a super low salary and not with a lot of kind of comfort and security or anything. But I think that's the only way that they can really pull out of this, and the only way that they're even going to have a shot at making it to champs later in the year is if they make a move now. I think if you wait, man, you're going to rely on some kind of NYSL 2022 run where you got to get second at a major to even get close to getting to champs, which is just unrealistic. It happened once. It might never happen again in CDL history. So, I think Boston needs to make a change. They had a lot of really missed opportunities, I would say, because they had, I think, the last 2 matches against G2 and Paris. If I remember correctly, they could have won both of those series. They had a chance to sweep, if I'm not mistaken. I know they did against Paris, and they let it slip away. And that's kind of a calling card of Boston, but they don't necessarily need to. If they kind of hit on the Spart pickup, at least from what we've seen so far. Nasty has been a great offseason pickup. I think Snoopy is always going to have the skill and the potential. Whether he's able to kind of round that into being like a fully formed player who, you can rely on in those big moments, I guess it remains to be seen. But yeah, they need to make a change. They need to at least try to be competitive. If they're not going to try, then like you said, they have to resort to selling Nasty, making sure they get as much money as possible for him in some kind of buyout, and let him go compete for championships rather than kind of toil away where he is now. And depending on how well Spark does the rest of the season, he might be in the similar position where if they're not going to be competitive, say, hey, like, would it be better if you went to another team that actually could get to champs versus just being on like the 11th or 12th place team in a 12-team league? That's a pretty depressing way of spending your CDL season. What else is Vancouver versus G2, I believe, is up next in these matches. So that was the last match on Friday. This was a absolutely big stomp. Like, I don't remember if this is the biggest hardpoint win. Maybe we had like a 250 to 55, if I remember correctly, some hardpoint. But this is one of the biggest hardpoint wins of the season, 250 to 70 in favor of G2 on Blackheart. So a map that we do not see very often in general, but a massive win for G2, 6-3 S&D win for G2, and then a 7-3 overload win for G2. This was, I would say, kind of unexpected because Surge had looked decent to good recently, and then they just reverted back to like the worst possible form that we've seen the Surge, maybe even like pre-roster changes back when they had a bunch of rookies and young guys at the beginning of the season. What did you make of this, really DoorDash kind of series?
Yeah, very confusing given what happens later in the week. I'm going to refrain from looping in Vancouver's other match because I think it is more important to loop that match in with the other associated team at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a vacuum here, this singular match, very confusing from both perspectives. I do think more so for G2. They have, I think, who was I watching? It must have been the Zuma watch party. Somebody pulled up G2's like breaking point page, and if you, what do I look at? Completed matches. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of their last 6 matches have been 3-0s in either way.
Yep.
And we've obviously talked a lot about they got 1-3-1 in there against Boston, but we talked about it at some point during this qualifiers how they were either getting 3-2 either way or 3-0s either way. And it's been a lot of 3-0s lately, and just the fact that it's so swingy in terms of, they get 3-0'd here and then they win 3-0, and it feels like a never-ending seesaw roller coaster, whatever phrase you want to use. I don't know how much stock to put into it. I don't know if it's like something to do with the online and like their server connections, and one match they're getting great ping and they're frying, and then the next match they're having issues and they're getting stomped. Like, I'm really like so perplexed with G2, and that just further leads to, going into this major. I'm actually saying this without remembering. They could, no, I know who FaZe plays. But I'm very confused about G2, and it could be another case where they go into this major and they play FaZe and they just beat FaZe again. Like, it's like I really don't know what to expect with G2 anymore. It seems like it's I keep on bringing this up, but like the closest thing to a comparison that I can come to is that Vancouver, or sorry, it would have been the Seattle Surge team in Vanguard with Sib, Mac, Pred, and Accuracy, where it felt like literally they could win an event and you flip a coin the next day and they're just losing every match they play. And obviously, I don't think G2 is in a position where they're necessarily a title contender right now, but you get the example. Like, it's just like they're very coin flippy. You don't know which version of the team is going to show up against who, or who's going to show up on that team itself. Like, a very weird position, but obviously good of them here to show up and take care of business against Vancouver.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, G2 is a very weird team. They were a weird team earlier in the season, and then I thought they found a groove when they started to beat FaZe, and that just has been kind of the thing. It's just been phase, really. They've been competitive with some of those other teams, but I said it on, I think, last week's episode, but I said, like, maybe they play down to their competition. If that's the case, then that didn't happen here. Like, I don't know what was going on, but maybe Vancouver had the worst series of their lives. I have really no idea. It just is very confusing, and that's just been the kind of the name of the game with the Major 2 qualifiers in general. Like, none of these teams, aside from OpTic, has been like remotely competitive or consistent, and that has been like very hard to predict, very hard to analyze, very hard to even just like kind of talk about in general. So I don't really know what to do with this.
I mean, we can loop in the other G2 match because we already talked about LAT and Gentlemates, but G2 plays LAT last match on Saturday, and they get double Kremp losses to start the series, still get 3-0'd by LAT. So it's got like 3-3 map count on the weekend, 1-1 series count. It is what it is. You picked G2, so maybe you can speak more to your outlook on this series. But overall, I mean, I still, especially in a series where they got cramp losses twice, to have them get 3-0'd by LAT, when LAT came into this with some of their own question marks, and in terms of recent performances and stuff, that's a bit of a mind blowing thing for me.
I think my reasoning was that LAT had been really shaky in search, and that Minnesota could stretch it out to game 5 and win that
Right.
search. But LAT, they went 3-0 in search this week
Yeah.
because they won both against Paris. They win Kremplossus SND 6-2. And then they sweep the series. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, maybe LAT turned a corner. Maybe G2 is just whatever. Like it really is. I mean, I think this is probably the best way to put it, is like, this is what middle of the pack teams do, and that's how they stay
Sure.
in the middle of the pack, is they win some matches where you're like, really, they won that, and then they lose matches like, really, they lost that. Like, and I think G2 is really in that kind of mode where, yes, they're going to beat FaZe. They might be able to beat. They've been really competitive with OpTic, for example, for a few matches, and that's all well and good. But then they lose to teams that they definitely shouldn't be losing to, or they just can't beat the top teams consistently. So they're always going to be scratching and clawing to be in that like 4th or 5th or 6th place spot, when really like the ceiling for that team is a lot higher than we're really seeing it. So yeah, it's been weird for G2. It's a great win, obviously, for LAT, because they finish with a 2-0 week, and they kind of move into Major 2 with some momentum. They did not have a ton of momentum going into Major 1, of course, and there was just a ton of talk about roster changes and what that major would mean. There's not that much talk, I guess, now, although that can always pop back up. If they get double first rounded at Major 2, I think it restarts, and there's a new person that's got to get benched or got to get dropped. And but at least for right now, LAT is in a good position. The S&D is very encouraging for them to win both of those S&Ds against Paris, to win against G2. I don't know what that necessarily means, because they're going to play, where they're going to play FaZe in that first round of the major, and we just saw FaZe. Maybe they have also turned a corner with their S&D. I guess that's a good place to kind of find out who's actually looking better at this current point. But yeah, LAT wins 3-0, beats G2. G2, they continued that 3-0 streak. Maybe they'll continue that at Major 2 as well. I think we already talked about Carolina versus Miami on Saturday. Do you want to talk any more about the FaZe versus C9? I know I think we touched more on it from a C9 perspective, but anything from FaZe that you saw?
I guess the only thing at that point in the week, this was just a very important. We talked about it. I think it would have been during the Major 1 qualifiers, but like just in general, the way FaZe have been playing, it was good to see them come out and get a 3-0 win against a team that FaZe should 3-0 every single day of the week. The first 2 maps were closer than probably some FaZe fans would have liked to see. But regardless, and in terms of tiebreakers and stuff, I feel like this was basically an essential 3-0 from FaZe. And, I don't think I linked it in here because obviously it changed, but there was a point on Saturday where it was going to be FaZe versus Gentlemates in the play-in match, and the winner was going to play OpTic. So I think that means that it was like FaZe and Gentlemates were the 8 and 9 seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And whoever won that would have played OpTic first round. And there were people like saying like it was like, and then LAT was in the other top part of the bracket, not against OpTic. So then like it would have set up like OpTic, FaZe slash Gentlemates, and LAT all in the top part of the bracket, and then the bottom part of the bracket was pretty weak. Obviously that's kind of changed now, and we'll get into that at a later point. But like in terms of the importance of this match, again, like that 3-0 could have been very huge for FaZe in the tiebreakers, and like if they lost the match to C9, like they could have very easily been in a position where they're in the play-in bracket, and it's pretty crazy to think about a match like this that a lot of people would previously just write off completely. Like potentially that was the difference between FaZe being in the play-in or being in the bracket.
Yeah, I thought for the longest time that the play-in was going to be like the NBA play-in, where you have basically a double elimination, and
Yeah.
that's not the case, which is so stupid. Like really, really stupid actually, because it's just the 9. It's what the 9 and 10 play. The winner of that
7, 10, 9, 8.
Yeah, okay. So, like, the winner of that match will play OpTic. The winner of that match will play Miami. I just thought it would be kind of a double, like a 4-team double elimination bracket.
Yeah.
The top 2 teams would get out. Wouldn't that make the most sense? Wouldn't that, like, give, like, all those teams, like, a chance to, like, you know, hey, like, you get another match, you get another shot at it.
Yeah.
And it gives you, like, what, 2 more matches? It really shouldn't upset the bracket or the schedule or anything, but...
I just guess the only... like logistical, well, I guess there's two, like in terms of scheduling and having the time to get all those matches in, where one thing we haven't even talked about is like, because this is a DreamHack event, it's only a 3-day event, it's not a 4-day event.
Yeah,
maybe if this was a 4-day event, you have more time to do you could just do like the play-in bracket on Thursday and then go into the bracket play on Friday. So that logistically might have been a nightmare, but I guess it's just weird to think about a double elimination bracket in the play-in, then leading into a double elimination bracket overall, because you could get into a scenario where, let's just say it was just because they're not in it, I'm just going to use FaZe as an example. Let's say FaZe was in the play-in bracket in your scenario where it's a double elimination. FaZe loses first match there and then wins to get into the bracket. They got to win 2 matches after that to get in or whatever. Then FaZe loses in the winner's bracket. They already have 2 losses, but they're not eliminated from the tournament.
Mm-hmm.
So they would technically have a chance to then, if they go down to the losers bracket of the main tournament and they lose, they would be eliminated with a 3rd loss, and that just gets into a situation where then you have other teams that weren't in the play-in bracket. They have 2 losses and they're eliminated. So it's a little weird in that sense, but it's definitely weird to me overall that some of these teams, especially because it's a UK tournament, if this was the format for a Texas tournament, it wouldn't matter as much given the fact that most of the teams are in Texas. But legitimately, 2 teams are about to fly to the other side of the world and could potentially play 3 maps and then have to fly home.
I have a problem with it just in general because I think it's stupid, but like, let's just play it out. Like, let's say that Carolina loses to Paris, which is a very likely thing to happen. Paris is the 10 seed. If this were a regular major, they would be starting in the losers bracket. Carolina would be starting in the winners bracket. Therefore, Carolina would be afforded 1 loss before they'd be eliminated. Paris would not be afforded that 1 loss. They would automatically be eliminated. So I think if you're thinking about it like that, with just specifically Carolina and Toronto, the 7 and 8 seed going into this major, in any other major, they would have that 1 loss in their pocket that if they were to get beat, they wouldn't be upset, but they would get beat in round 1, that at least they would have a chance to kind of defend their honor essentially in the losers bracket. They don't get that here. They play the 10 seed. Granted, like, you know, you should beat them theoretically, but you only get that one match, and then you play Miami. If you win, you go home. If you lose, I think it's a really silly thing. I think it just would have made a lot more sense if you're like, if you have to start them earlier on the first day, like, hey, like those matches need to go like really quick. Like we're going to start it at like 10 a.m. local time. Hopefully they'll be done all by like 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. And so we can start the bracket at that point. And then, we'll give them a little of a break that we'll get the G2 and Falcons match and the LAT phase match. And then we'll have OpTic and Miami that have their matches the last part of the day. So everybody can kind of fit that in. I just think like it really is a horrible look if especially if both Carolina and Toronto lose, because in any other major they would have just dropped down to the losers bracket and had another chance at it. They don't get that with major 2, which maybe I'm not making as big of a deal about it. If I knew this the entire time that we were doing the major 2 qualifiers, I had it in my brain. I was like, oh, so it's just like the NBA. And the NBA is not perfect, or the plan's not perfect by any means, but I think it is pretty entertaining. It gives these people or these teams, a shot to get into the playoffs. And I mean, this is a really important major. Like to, 2 teams didn't even get to go to DreamHack this year. So, these other 2 teams that lose in the play-in, I would assume are going to be really salty about it. And I think rightfully so. It's a very weird setup that we haven't seen before in the CDL. So that was FaZe versus C9, obviously. And then we get to Falcons versus OpTic. So it's just easier to talk about Falcons like in one fell swoop, because this was a tale of 2 halves, basically. On Saturday, they beat OpTic. They're the first and only team in the Major 2 qualifiers to beat OpTic Texas. OpTic started 9-0 in the qualifiers. They finished 10-1, but the Falcons are that one. And then on the first match of Sunday, the Falcons lose to the Vancouver Surge, who got mollywopped by Vancouver or by G2 earlier in the week. So,
oh boy,
yeah. So Falcons, and granted, it was a close series against Vancouver. They narrowly lost the opening hardpoint. They nearly came back and won the first S&D. They 100-point clubbed Vancouver in the second hardpoint. But they still lose the series. They still lose the Game 5 S&D 6-2. So what do you make of Falcons beating the best team and then losing to one of the worst teams?
I mean, it's a kind of a comparison to what I was saying with G2. It's like that coin flipping nature is just, I don't know what to make of it, especially just given how dominant OpTic have looked. For a team to beat OpTic and then immediately turn around and lose to a team like Vancouver, the way Vancouver played earlier this week especially, it's just very perplexing, and I have no idea what to make of it. You can argue that maybe Falcons went in with extra motivation against OpTic and then took their foot off the pedal a little bit against Vancouver. That would just be a very disappointing way to look at it, though. You would expect a team that's coming off such a high of beating the unbeaten OpTic to be like, okay, this is our turning point. Let's kick it into high gear, and all the cliches or whatever you want to say about like turning things around and starting to go on a bit of a run. It's just a pretty disappointing way to end the qualifiers, and literally I've talked about seesaws and roller coasters enough this episode alone, but to just go from that high of beating OpTic and immediately turn around and lose to Vancouver is very, very weird, and I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I would love to be sitting here singing the praises of Falcons for beating OpTic and have that to be the note going into the major for them, because I think I said it last episode, but if I didn't, maybe it was the one before that. No, I think it would have been last episode, because I was like, we talked about the Falcons and OpTic history so far this season, where they played in that first match for the teams of the season. OpTic stomped them, and then we get to a point where Falcons were looking strong towards the end of the Major 1 qualifiers. OpTic were on a bit of a slump, and they get that rematch in Major 1 with Falcons potentially being like, okay, we get a shot at redemption here. Didn't matter. They got stomped again. So I think I and you both kind of, and a lot of other people probably just wrote Falcons off before the series even started. And, um, it's been a case where Exnid in particular has played really, really well. Just he has completely flipped the narrative on himself in terms of his expectations and what people expect to see from him in less than or just over a year now of his tenure in the CDL. Kismet had a pretty strong performance in this series in particular, but um, yeah, there was also for just the Falcons and OpTic thing. Their Dashy was complaining a little bit about lag. I think Clay said something. It was on Falcons end too. I thought that was kind of like, you know, it sucks to have just in an objective perspective, like OpTic had played so well in these qualifiers, and then they lose one match, which really doesn't affect them in any way other than just not getting 10 CDL points. And immediately the excuse comes out that they're having lag and stuff, which obviously if it was a big deal and affecting both teams, it is what it is. It's not an excuse, but yeah, I just think overall, I it in on its own, it was a massive victory for Falcons in terms of now they know they can beat OpTic, and previously they couldn't say that, and they've matched up against them multiple times before this point, and it was pretty decisive for OpTic. But this could have been a massive turning point for them in this season, and technically it still could be, but to have this win followed by a loss against Vancouver, who Vancouver just got stomped by G2, like you said, very perplexing. And they did have a 100-point club in the map 4 hard point, pretty convincing in the overload. The map 1 hard point was pretty close, and from a Vancouver perspective, I highlighted Big Cap dropped 44, and it felt like for me that was like the first performance out of Capsidal that we've really gotten from him, where like he stood out statistically. I feel like he's had a lot of performances in his return to the CDL where he's just had a ton of engagements, and it's not necessarily led to the flashiest stat line, but this was the first time, for me at least, in my recollection of his performances so far, where, 44 and 38, that's still a ton of engagements, and obviously it's just a ton of kills too. Um, but Exnid was right behind him with 42 and 32, so Exnid still played well, despite the loss in that map. And the map 2 for Falcons, they're up 4-1, and they lose 5 rounds in a row after that. There was a funny interaction on the raid S&D interaction might not be the right word. Setup is more apt. In front of Laundry, I think it was Kismet and Exnid, but I can't remember who it was. I sent it to Tremi right away because it reminded me of a setup that we did in Dubs GBs back in the day. Obviously, long time coming from that, but they were laying down in front of Laundry, and it was one player was like laying down to the point where if somebody jumped out a Laundry window or went down the stairs, they would be right in front of them. And the other person was laying down behind them to the point if they came out of the little like the ledge to the side of Laundry where you can fall off the map, that person would have to walk in front of the second guy laying down, but it would have been between the person in front of them. And it worked out perfectly. 2 people on Vancouver ran down in both entrances. They got the kills, and I was like, that is the funniest setup, and it might not work now because they showed it, but I loved seeing that. And obviously, it didn't lead to a Falcons win in the end, but I had to bring that up because I just thought it was super funny in the moment. And uh yeah, I mean, those were 2 matches, obviously 2 maps where Falcons up 4-1 in the search, and they a couple kills go their other way in the map 1. Maybe it's a close win for Falcons as opposed to a close win for Vancouver, but they had some winnable maps in this series that could have went the other way, and it just wasn't the map 5 where Vancouver had 7 first bloods out of 8 total rounds. Gwyn had 9 kills, Cap had 9 kills, TJ had 7 kills. It was a Vancouver masterclass, really, in the game 5. And like I said, overall, just the fact that Falcons beat OpTic and follow it right up with a loss to a team that especially after you beat OpTic, should be very winnable on paper. Now Falcons is right there in the list of the other teams with me not knowing what to expect from them going into Major 2.
Yeah, I think the Falcons are the perfect example. I said it with G2 that they win matches that they probably shouldn't, and then they lose matches that they probably shouldn't. This Falcons team is way better of an example of this, because if you look at their matches in the qualifiers, their wins are against Carolina, C9, FaZe, LAT, OpTic, and Toronto. And then their losses are to the Boston Breach, not going to Major 2. They lost to Minnesota 3-2. Surprise, surprise. They lost to Miami 3-0. They lost to the 4-7 Paris Genomates 3-1. And they lost to the Vancouver Surge 3-2. So 3 of their 5 losses in these qualifiers were to 3 of the bottom 4 teams in the actual qualifier standings. So like there's just no way that you can kind of predict that. They beat 2 or 3 of the top 4 teams in these qualifiers and then lose to 3 of the bottom 4 teams. That can't happen if you're going to try to be like a true contender, if you're going to try to turn the corner like you were just saying. They have the 4th best map count of any team in these qualifiers, and they tied for 4th place. But I don't think that we're, really fooled into thinking that they're super close to OpTic, even though they beat OpTic, because who knows the kind of Falcons that will show up if they actually play OpTic on LAN, and who knows how they'll look against LAT on LAN, and how will they look against FaZe. It just kind of continues where there's no way to really tell if this is a competitive team, if this team could actually compete for championships. And that's frustrating, I'm sure, if you're a Falcons fan. Certainly a much better scenario this year than it was last year, where they're like, all right, maybe we're not going to make the major. And on the other side, you have Vancouver, and their 4 wins in the qualifiers were against the Boston Breach, C9, both teams that are not going to Major 2, and then they beat the Paris Genomates, and they beat the Falcons. So because Vancouver is also in that bottom 4, they were the tied with Paris for 9th place. So they beat the 3 teams that are in the bottom 4 with them, and then Falcons. So the Falcons really should not be losing this type of match in that regard either. So I'm baffled by this. I don't know how they were able to beat OpTic and then lose to Vancouver, but that is the Major 2 qualifiers in a nutshell. None of this makes sense. I don't know if this really means anything for OpTic. Of course, they bounce back later in the week, but I don't know if that will continue into Major 2. Of course, they finished Major 1 qualifiers on a pretty low note with those losses, and then were able to make a run. I don't know if going on this big win streak before Major 2 is going to have a reverse effect, but I guess we're going to have to see when the teams land in England. We already talked about LAT versus G2. We talked about Vancouver versus Falcons. We already talked about Genomates versus LAT. Miami Boston's really nothing. Obviously, we talked about Boston finishing up. So the last match of the weekend that we need to talk about is Toronto versus OpTic. OpTic, of course, they lose that match against the Falcons, like we were just talking about, and then they come back and they sweep Toronto. Was it just kind of a blip, you think, for the Falcons match? Did you see anything in this that would make you think otherwise?
I'm going to just defer. I hate the excuses, and I've been pretty vocal of that in previous instances, regardless of the team and stuff, but I'm going to just go out on a limb and say maybe the internet/lag stuff potentially in the Falcons OpTic series might have played a bigger part than some people want to recognize. But regardless of that, I think this was always the anticipated result for OpTic versus Toronto. I do think it was definitely interesting that OpTic was willing to play double Den in the series, because Den was map 1 and it would have been map 5 if it went there. Obviously that wasn't the case, but I think given OpTic's position and wanting to test out maps, and the narrative around Toronto being really strong at Den, this was a very good opportunity for OpTic to get a quality Den rep in, not just like testing a map against a team that's like whatever on that map. they're testing out a map that they haven't played a ton or haven't had a ton of success on so far, and they're playing it against a team that's really good at that map, and that's like the highest quality rep you can get in that situation. And OpTic still came out on top. Obviously, a bit of an outlier because Kips absolutely fries 34 and 26, but Insight goes 9 and 23.
Yikes.
So they kind of cancel each other out a little bit. But yeah, in the end, this was, obviously what most people expected. I'm gonna go with the phrasing of a tactical loss from OpTic against Falcons to avoid like heading in with the undefeated 1 seed and trying to avoid some curse or whatever for Major 2. But yeah, I did think it was certainly noteworthy that OpTic wanted to get a rep on Den against a good Den team in Toronto, but in the end, it didn't really matter. Just OpTic 3-0.
Yeah, OpTic, they finished the qualifiers 10-1. They won 31 of their 41 maps for a plus 75% map win percentage. So, obviously they locked up the number 1 seed before this final week anyway. But yeah, they clear every other team by at least 3 matches. Tied for second place was Miami and LAT at 7-4. Neither of them even hit 65% map win percentage. So OpTic at 75%. And then you had the Falcons, G2, FaZe, and Carolina all with 6-5 records, so they all had to straighten themselves out with the tiebreakers and all that. Toronto, they went 5-6. They were the only team with 5 wins. Then Vancouver and Paris with 4 wins. They were the last 2 teams to make it into Major 2. And then, of course, we talked about it with Boston and C9. Boston at 3-8, C9 at 2-9. They did not make it to Major 2. They had the 2 worst map win percentages, as you might expect. Although, if you look at it, Vancouver was 14-26 in their maps. Boston was 14-27 in their maps, and Vancouver is able to move on because they won those matches against Boston and all the other bottom teams, plus the Falcons at the very end. So, pretty weird standings, I would say, considering I thought it would be a lot clearer after 11 matches.
I didn't fully understand the breakdown of the tiebreakers, but I just thought it was a little weird that G2 is 20-20 map count, 6-5, and Carolina 6-5, 20-20 map count, and obviously G2 gets the 5th seed, Carolina gets the 7th, which in a normal situation, as you outlined, wouldn't have been a huge difference, but here it's the difference between playing a one and done match to survive versus having the guarantee of being in the winner's bracket right away.
Yeah, the tiebreakers goes like it went like this: head to head match win percentage. So like if you the 5-way tie, I believe, in the middle of the standings, they take all of those matches and like whoever has like a 2-1 record, blah blah blah, and then they go to head to head map win percentage, overall match win percentage, which obviously that makes no sense because we know that they're tied. Overall map win percentage. I mean, it's really, really complicated, especially the more teams you get, because then you have to loop everybody in versus like if the 2-way ties are easy because everybody played each other and we know that it's a head to head. And I thought that, like I even said that before we got started with the Major 2 qualifiers, that I expected that to be really easy. I was like, well, the tiebreakers will suss itself out because every team plays every team and we won't really have any tiebreakers. And then the end, it's like almost all of these teams are tied with somebody at the end of the qualifiers. So it's been weird, but yeah, the way we got it was OpTic, of course, got the number 1 seed. Miami got the number 2 seed as according to their tiebreaker with LAT. LAT got the 3 seed. They would play FaZe Vegas, the number 6 seed in the bracket, and then Riyadh Falcons and G2, regardless of where they were, 4 or 5, they would still play each other in that match. And then, like we've been talking about, the play-in is Toronto versus Vancouver. Toronto being that 7 seed, Toronto being the 8 seed, Vancouver being the 9. They play OpTic, whoever wins that. And then you have Carolina, the 7 seed, versus Paris, the 10 seed, which is still crazy to think about. The winner of that plays Miami in round 1. So it's going to be crazy. I have no idea what to expect. Maybe Paris kind of turns it on once they get to land and are able to make a run. Um, FaZe and LAT playing round one is super exciting. We got to see FaZe lose in winners round one at Major One. LAT did not have a good major one. They did win round one, but they didn't have a very good major as a whole. So we'll have to see how that actually works out. The pick'em, we both went 7-4. We disagreed on a few matches, and we're still able to come out the same. You are 78-48 on the season. I am 80-46. I would expect it to be even closer, or maybe you even take the lead at Major 2. It's been very difficult to predict this entire season, although I do think, whatever that is, 80 divided by 130, basically. So that's like 60 plus. Yeah, I mean, if we're betting men, we might be able to make some money off of this, but no, we're still broke.
Puckett's negative on the season. He's obviously a little trolly, but they've been joking about it on the broadcast how his picks have not worked out so far. So we're at least doing better than Puckett for sure.
I mean, if either one of us is negative with our picks, we got to end the podcast because that makes no sense. Yeah, so obviously this has been weird to do it on a Monday, but depending on when that Sunday, obviously UConn has to win on Friday to make it to Sunday. But if they do, and if they play another late game, I might be asleep again because I'm not staying up until like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock to watch you to do the podcast and maybe watch UConn before that.
We would probably want UConn to be a late game on Sunday just because we have to remember this is a UK event, so 6 hours ahead of time means the finals is probably going to be at like 2-3 in the afternoon for us on Sunday.
Yeah, that's gonna be different. Maybe we're able to do the podcast pretty early on Sunday. Maybe, who knows?
We'll have to see.
Yeah, it's really gonna depend. But we'll be back regardless on Wednesday, most likely to talk about the matches. So this is a Friday through Sunday event, not a Thursday through Sunday event. So if you're used to the majors that have been happening for like the past 5 years at this point, it's going to be different. It's only 3 days this week. So you get Thursday off, and usually we would do this preview, the major preview on Tuesday to try to offset that, but we're still good with the Wednesday.
It's also 2 streams for at least Friday. They haven't put out the times yet because I just checked the CDL schedule, but COD League tweeted it, and we'll obviously talk about this in the preview show. But 8 matches on Friday, 4 on Alpha stream and 4 on Bravo stream. So that's a bit of a throwback for CWL or MLG fans.
Yeah, so we'll, regardless, we'll be back on Wednesday to talk about the matches. We'll break it all down, give our predictions for who we think will win, MVP, all that good stuff. And then we'll be back on Sunday, hopefully at some point, to talk about the tournament, break that all down. So again, Wednesday, March 25th, if you want to tune in live, you can do so on YouTube or Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. Same with Sunday. The podcast will be up on Thursday mornings as usual, and then hopefully on Monday morning as well. You can make sure to subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as the YouTube that I just mentioned. I think we're around 290 subscribers, so hopefully we can hit 300 by the end of major three qualifiers, which would be nice. Follow us on Twitter at jbank with 2Ks, at Preston Byers. The podcast tour is at Ego Chall Podcast. Again, if you want to watch any of these streams live, you can do so on YouTube or on Twitch. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink's Twitch, twitch.tv/jbank with 2Ks. And our next show, again, will be on Wednesday, and we'll make sure to preview. We've talked about it before, but the previews are always pretty fun. They're a lot looser, a lot less rigid than the matches because we don't have 15 matches to talk about every week. So I'm excited to do that, and I think that about does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Shout out Rickus Morty in the YouTube chat for stopping by and chit-chatting a bit. Shout out that J-Bink guy for dropping a Prime sub in the Twitch chat. I don't know who that is, but he sounds like a pretty cool guy. And yeah, like I said at the start, a bit of a lengthy process to get through these online qualifiers for Major 2, but we did it. we're through the online stuff. We're into the LAN and the hype action of an actual tournament again. Is going to be a bit different because, like Preston said, 3-day tournament, UK hours for the US fans. It's it's going to be a little funky, but nonetheless, I'm excited to watch them land Call of Duty again, and a bunch of interesting storylines, narratives, all that we can break down on the preview show coming up. So look forward to that. Hope to see everybody there, and until then, remember to send the chow.